direct descendant of this aesthetic separation. What the novelist inherits from the age of aesthetics is the idea that our pleasures are experienced in the gap, the cut that predicated aesthetic pleasure upon its removal from the space and time of everyday life. The literary experience of the beautiful reminds us that while shareable in principle, our contemplative pleasures occur as an instance of withdrawal from the human community more directly. While many aestheticians, including Kant himself, dedicated themselves to repairing these lacerations, I hope to have shown that this healing is not without scars. Moreover, I hope to have demonstrated that attending to these wounds helps us to shed light on the historically unprecedented experience of the beautiful. This experience consists of joining together, at the risk of paradox, detachment and attachment, solitude and fellow feeling, communicability without communication, shareability without sharing. Thank you. Please.
So we have, maybe 10 minutes or so. I know many people have commitment at 3:30. So, but would you like to field them yourself?
Sure.
I'll take that first shot then. I was curious about this definition of taste being hooked to shareability, because the way that word seems to be used colloquially, at least, is to be discriminating. It would not be exercising good taste to say the people who win on American Idol are in fact America's best singers, right? That usually the role of the critic is to sort of discriminate and say, it's some level hinges on this sort of lowbrow, highbrow sort of notion. And so I was curious if taste is thought of with respect to shareability, if it does at some level lead to sort of a lowest common denominator vision of what art is, that it ends up being that which is most gaudy or sensational or something along those lines.
That's good. I'm trying to think, like, what is there in Kant that would stop that movement? Primarily his sense that in Kant at least, and speaking about Kant at least, first, there's the sense that the primary source of our aesthetic pleasure is beauty we find in the natural world, and that's shareable. You're right, though, that and so that would resist some of the American Idol conceptions of what's beautiful. That
but maybe Niagara Falls emerges as what's most beautiful, and not everyone would agree.
And the desire in Kant at least is to deprive the judgment of as much empirical content as possible, and to tie it more to the way in which an object is capable of sustaining the play of the cognitive faculties. And so it's something which will be a much more abstract form of pleasure, and probably a more difficult form of pleasure as a result of that. And it would be a specifically reflective form of pleasure. I think, though, you're on good grounds, just operating with a Kantian framework, and this is probably not a problem that he anticipated, to say that what distinguishes those forms of pleasure is that they don't tend to have this double structure, this dual characteristic of being simultaneously something which is sensual and intelligible, or something which appeals to both imagination, understanding, sense, and reason. That those are almost always, those pleasures of the lowest common denominator really aren't aesthetic pleasures at all, as Kant would understand them. They're just pleasures of the agreeable. They're always going to be subjective and really not interesting from a philosophical point of view, because we don't kind of have the same expectations for universality about them. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. It's great to see you at work. And I was really fascinated by your account of this oscillation that takes place, or that you point out in the text, but in the experience of the beautiful itself.
Yeah.
The shareability and at the same time it's unshareability. And I was wondering if you had read the work of Jose Esteban Munoz.
No, no.
Because he has this whole amount of art in terms of world making. And so I was thinking that despite the fact that I was wondering what you would think of beautiful, which moves away from sort of the attempt of trying to understand a general conception of what the beautiful means, given that you end up with these paradoxes and contradictions. Even though in the gap you can get some kind of connection, right?
Right.
Even though it's as fleeting as it may be. And think of it in terms of the activity of world making that is entailed in the artwork. So that when you are presented with an artwork, an object of art, and you experience the sublime, it's a process of world making, which may or may not be
In the Heideggerian sense of world,
I
or
think it's very Heideggerian.
yeah.
Right? It's not. I think Munoz is looking at it a little bit differently, but it's this idea that what's important about the experience of art is it's disclosing, right? A process of disclosure, and that could be a disclosure that gives us something and doesn't leave us completely
Good.
isolated.
I think that's right, and I think it's certainly possible to articulate theories and conceptions of art like that, in which by insisting upon the even just by insisting upon the material nature of the artwork as a physical object that exists in a world and has a material cultural history, and all of the significance of that. I mean, people who speak about artworks in terms of labor, in terms of its connections with the natural world, with communities, the way in which it represents the concerns of different communities, can take that path. I don't know that that's a properly aesthetic approach to works of art. I mean, those are fine theories, and I think that's a part of our encounter with art. But there's also I'm interested in the unintelligible aspects of our experience with art, and I think you also get that in the Heideggerian account of art. Like, if it's earth and world together, right, in the origin of the work of art. And I'm not speaking about the author you mentioned directly, but I think it's germane. Heidegger, who in the origin of the work of art wants to take so much distance from the history of aesthetics, right? Aesthetics is the element in which art dies, he says, is actually standing on it and really inheriting it, particularly, and you see it particularly in the notion of earth and world, because you see the same structure that I'm pointing to, I think, namely the world is that which is intelligible or shareable, and the earth is that which resists intelligibility. It's the materiality of the work of art which thought can't penetrate. And so I would think, like, even in this theory of art that you're describing, one would emphasize the shareability that results from it being part of a world and a world-making process, in as much as we experience it within the framework of the aesthetic. Once we bring those parameters and those expectations to it and ask, is it pleasing, we introduce this irreducibly subjective moment, which is difficult to then paper over and restore community entirely and completely. And so I'm interested in that resistance and in that tension. Thanks. Please.
Something to be before what needs to be beautiful. How is that possible? Everyone wants to see something beautiful, since everyone has taste change too. My taste change.
Well, it's not the claim is not that it has to be shared in order for it to be beautiful. It's just the idea that when we say something is beautiful, we're saying more than simply I like it. And so Kant is really interested in this quirk of our language, whereby we're saying something more than I like it. We're speaking as though beauty exists somewhere in the object and everybody else ought to be able to find it. And so he wants to know if it's even legitimate to speak that way, or if we should instead all the time banish this word beauty from our vocabulary and just say, I like it, I like it, I like it. It's pleasing to me. But the times when you think about the times in your life when you've and you put yourself on a limb when you do this, there are times in your life where you will just be struck by something and say, my God, it's beautiful. In that moment, you expect others to be able to find it as well. They won't always. but you expect it. And this is what Kant is analyzing and trying to describe. That when we use that word beauty, we have an expectation that it will be shared. Not a confirmation, not a guarantee that our judgment is right. And so he's looking for what is it which allows for us to be more or less right about these judgments, which he calls judgments of taste. And he says that when we become better at separating out the things which are unique or peculiar to us and taking account of how others may experience it as well, then we hit the mark more often if we're capable of doing that. That's what it means to learn to judge with taste. And he says nobody can teach you how to do this. All that your teachers can't teach you how to judge with taste. They can just prompt you to reconsider your own judgment, and eventually, maybe you will educate yourself in the way of taste. Please, and then. No, of course not. But why? Well, there's I think like that's what I'm pointing to in this paper is the sense that the beautiful is unique and peculiar to us and something our own, and something which there's something about our experience with it which will never completely entirely be shared, even though when we say something is beautiful, we expect that others will be able to see it too. I think that depending on who we're talking about, which aesthetician we're talking about, the theory of taste or theories of taste are articulated to try to give us reasons for believing in our own relationship with works of art, rather than taking over what the dominant culture has taught us to find to be beautiful. There's some very moving passages in Kant that people don't often talk about, where he mentions all the famous critics of the day and says, like, I'm going to ignore all of these people. I will not listen to your judgment if you're giving these critics as authorities, unless I experience it myself. And when we judge, when we judge something with taste, we do so in a radically contingent way. If our evaluation is determined by our position within a culture, right? We just judge something to be beautiful because our teachers taught us that way, or our family always thought these things were beautiful, or Americans are trained to see beauty in this type of thing, then we're not really judging with taste. And so in this regard, the theory, there's something subversive about the theory of taste, actually, because it puts all the responsibility on the individual to judge for him or herself.
I heard in the question, the thing I heard, and it seemed very interesting in this context, is the question about, so if I change my mind about whether it's beautiful or not, and that element of time, especially since we're dealing with Proust, effective memory, and I might not be able to wrap my head around it, but I just thought it was an interesting question that was posed. I wonder if you could comment on that. And I'm thinking, even about Duchamp or Aura, for just a 25-year period, something might hold its effect. And I suppose I'm asking in terms of this idea of universality, is it time bound?
The most important thing always, speaking for the Kantian position, is to determine what's the determining ground for the judgment. If it's some type of, if there's something which is, Kant thinks we get better at doing this as we get older, that we get better at separating out interest from our judgments, like when we have something that's peculiar to us, which moves us to find certain things to be beautiful. I used to think Tom Wesselmann was a beautiful painter, and I realized that was probably because he was from Ohio, and I wanted there to be a great modern artist from Ohio, right? And so like I was able to identify the determining ground was a type of interest, and then once I was able to see things a little bit more objectively, I got better at this. So time does play a role, and so there is some. It plays a role in the sense, but there's nothing in Kant, there's no rule, there's no concept which would tell us that your letter judgment is necessarily better either. and Kant is not at all shy about bringing us to the radical contingency of the judgment of taste, like the radically contingent, audacious nature of the judgment of taste. When we judge something to be beautiful, we extrapolate and universalize on nothing but our own feeling before a given presentation, our own feeling of pleasure before a given presentation. There is a sense that the more frequently we make such judgments, we become better at separating them from interest. The key thing is to identify what's the determining ground for the judgment. Is it the relationship with the object and our ability to assess the potential shareability of the sensation it induces, or is it some other interest? You're right, it's especially complicated with Proust because it would seem to lend credence to the view that his latter judgment about the shareability of this pleasure is the true judgment, or his correct position. But what I'm saying is there's so many evolving and shifting positions in that book. It's difficult to say which one is determinative, for one, and so we have to, I think, take them all together, or not at all, or at least be mindful of the fact that we're constructing this text as we read it as much. We're constructing our own text out of it as we read it, and foreground that process, which is what I was trying to do. Like, I mean, I was quite deliberately using Proust to construct an allegory to speak to what I see as something integral to the experience of the beautiful. Nevertheless, I do think that I'm on good grounds for doing so with Proust because recollection plays such an important role in that book, and so even though something occurs earlier, doesn't necessarily mean that there's an evolution to the latter position. Because when we read that latter, actually, I think the process, at least my thought is that in Proust's mind, that we would read the first passage and think nothing of it, because there's quite a lot that leads us along onto another thought. So we'd read that first passage with Albertine and think nothing of it, and then we'd be struck by the moment with his mother, and maybe go back to that passage. And in going back to that passage, we actually experience that passage later. And so that's the one that I think sort of gives us the impression, or the dominant flavor of the book. It's certainly in keeping with the larger flavor of the book, with this really strong, at times really strong philosophical idealism, which tips over into a type of solipsism. And so I don't think there's a sense that because that view occurs later, there's a redemptive conception of the beautiful at work in that book. That's what I would be inclined to argue.
Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.